This video concept has definitely been done before, but I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring for it. Here's how I go about building all of my decks. The four most important things to think about when starting a new deck is 1, your land, then your card draw, then ramp, and then finally your win cons. If you have those 4 things in place, the rest of your deck can follow. For lands, we're going to want 36. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay, well, at least for a starting place in all your decks. If you're running a ton of 1-mana elves, for example, you're probably going to want to cut down on some of those lands, maybe only running 33 or so. But if you're running a Lands Matter deck or a ramp deck, you're going to want to put up to 40 in the deck. If you're missing land drops in the middle of the game in a landfall deck, you may just be screwed for a large part of the game. That's why I always start with 36. You literally can't play Magic without them, so start with a decent amount. Play your deck like 20 times, see how it plays, and then decide from there if you feel like it's too much or too little. So if lands are the backbone of a deck, the card draw is the brain. Without it, you're going to be a sitting duck with no cards in hand, praying you get what you want from the top of your library. I hate being in that position. I always put in 10 to 12 card draw spells. 10 is a minimum. Do not put less than 10 in any deck. I used to try and fit every big cool creature in my deck, and I could definitely have them in hand, and then I wouldn't be able to cast them because I wouldn't have the resources for it, or I couldn't draw into any ramp. If you have the choice between a fantastic thing and a card draw spell, always opt for the card draw spell if you've only got like 9 in the deck so far. A similar thing goes for ramp as well. People try and shove in more ramp than card draw into non-landfall decks, and for sure you're going to have the lands, but then you'll have nothing to cast. This could be considered controversial, but card draw is more important than land ramp every time. Would you rather have a card draw spell on turn 8 or a ramp spell on turn 8? You could get more lands, sure, but a card draw spell will hopefully find the answer you're looking for in that moment. Moving on to the ramp of the deck that I've kind of just somewhat shat on just now. If you're having a hard time finding ramp or knowing what ramp is for any color of deck, check out my comprehensive list of mana playlist right here. It goes through all the ramp knowledge you'll ever need. I always put in 10 ramp spells, but like I said before, this excludes landfall decks and elf ball decks because that's what those decks want to do. You're going to have a bunch of those in there. But otherwise, you should shoot for that sweet spot of 10. If you got less than that, you could be stuck with no lands, and if you get too many, then you're just going to get mana flooded. This can go up or down 1 depending on what you want, but if you're playing like a landfall deck, you probably want 15 or more. Okay, the fourth thing here is the win cons. Manfred, I can hear you say, why are we essentially starting the meat of the deck with the win cons? Shouldn't that be last? Well, reviewer, that's how I used to think as well. The win cons are basically an afterthought. Okay, I got all my cool things. I'm gonna shove these in, and then, okay, maybe I'll have like 1 in here. I don't know. They're basically an afterthought, and that's actually a crucial mistake. By thinking about how you want to close the game first, the more likely you are to accomplish that goal. If I shove in a ton of my favorite creatures with lots of card draw and all the spells and all the bells and whistles, then I get to the end of deck building and I've got 1 sleeve left to fill, you'll find that you can put in maybe 1 finale of something card, and that's the one thing you've got going for you. Sure, your deck will have all the shiny things, but then you'll most likely use it all and you'll swing out and then get board wiped by the guy that survived. You want to avoid that. Win condition cards for each color look different, and you should think about what your deck wants to do before you pile in 40 creatures. If you're looking to gain lots of life, think about Felidar Sovereign or Test of Endurance. If you're looking to mill out, use Jace Wielder of Mysteries, Laboratory Maniac, and Thassa's Oracle. If you're planning to make lots of treasures or cast demons, use Revel in Riches or Liliana's Contract. If you're wanting to play the late game, choose Insurrection or build up a bunch of artifacts and use Hellkite Tyrant. If you really want to use those big fun creatures, swing out with Craterhoof Behemoth or Triumph of the Hordes. Win cons take all sorts of shapes and sizes, but make sure you've got 3. If you've got too many, you'll probably keep drawing them and you only have like a couple creatures out or whatever, and then you're just stuck with them. But if you've got the right amount, it'll come at the right time, or you'll have it in your hand the whole game, you know, something like that. Here's where we get to the bread and butter of the deck. We need to have at least 17 to 20 cards that make the deck do what it does. This ties into the win cons we just talked about. How are you going to pull off winning, essentially? This looks different in every type of deck, of course, and my Neyith of the Dire Hunt deck looks vastly different from my Niv-Mizzet Patron deck, for example. Neyith seeks to have lots of big green and red creatures that just stomp down the board, while Niv-Mizzet's strategy is just to draw a ton of cards constantly. And that differs even more from my Sidisi Brood Tyrant deck, which seeks to flood the board with 2/2 zombies that slowly get bigger and bigger. Since you have your win cons already chosen, you already know where your deck is going and the composition of your deck that you need. So let's take my Neyith deck for an easy example. I have 19 bread and butter creatures in the deck. That might seem like too few, but here's why. The theme of the deck is to have big beasts come out and stomp the board, right? These 19 creatures are the 19 unadulterated creatures that just make the deck run. The other 11 creatures in the deck, they work double time as my ramp, my card draw, and my removal. So if I put too many of these singularly bread and butter cards in the deck, you're not gonna have enough space for the cards that can serve multiple purposes, if that makes sense. Now let's move on to targeted removal. I've talked about it with one of my groups I play with, and we all seem to be in agreement that about 7 to 9 targeted removal spells is best. Maybe even 10 in certain circumstances. I used to only put 3 to 5 in my decks with 3 to 4 board wipes, but that kind of gameplay tends to just make games last significantly longer and just makes a slog of a game. If you can get rid of threats as they come instead of waiting for the right moment for a board wipe, you know, your game is just going to be really long, your game experience is going to be boring, and you know, you can get more games in if you just constantly go. 7 to 9 spots lets you have the answers you need while also not feeling like too much. If you have more than this, your friends will hate you because you're constantly destroying things while not doing as much yourself. And if you have less than this, like 3 to 5, you won't be threatening and your opponents can take advantage of that, and then they'll cast big threats under your nose just constantly. And there's definitely a balance, and I think right now it's the 7 to 9 range. We just spoke briefly about board wipes or mass removal. That is not a bad thing at all. It gets bad when you have too many. If you want to essentially start the game over every 3 turns with a board wipe, it's not fun. I've been there plenty of times, and I'd personally rather lose and then play the next game than wipe the board over and over and over again in the hopes that I'll win. I've been running 1 to 2 mass removal spells lately. You've got to have at least one just in case, and another one depending on the deck can be very helpful. This changes though if you have specific mass removal. Cards like In Garruk's Wake, Hour of Reckoning, and Nylea's Intervention remove one type of thing. Just your opponent's creatures, just non-token creatures, or just creatures with flying. I'd say have 1 to 2 generic mass removal spells, but maybe swap out 1 or 2 of your targeted removal spells for one of these types. They are, after all, targeted mass removal spells, so just be careful on your mana curve. Our next 1 to 3 slots are going to be filled with protection spells. This is definitely my specific way of thinking, and you could skip this if you wanted to, but I find that protection spells are extremely valuable to keep out your best things, to keep your commander out, or you know, whatever you need. What are the cards that are going to protect your commander? What are the cards that are going to protect your engine? You know, these are the things you need to think about. These cards are vital in keeping your game plan moving forward. This could include counter spells, other instant spells, or even equipment. In my Madomai the Ageless deck, I've got the aptly named Teferi's Protection, Swiftfoot Boots, and Hindering Light. The whole deck focuses on Madomai, so I need to keep him out as long as possible. It's going to look different in every deck, but keeping the deck running is crucial, so I'd highly recommend some protection. For the next section, I tried to come up with a different name because the command zone uses this, but I feel like it's just really appropriate and there's no synonyms that are really good for it. Enablers. These help your deck run, and that's it. They don't do anything else but that. These are the cards that sit on the sidelines and help your deck run, and run better than it normally would have. These take the form of artifacts and enchantments usually, but there are always exceptions to that rule. Stuff like Panharmonicon, Doubling Season, or Fiery Emancipation. These cards are just extremely great in the decks that they're in, and when you see them across the table you think, ah crap, I'm screwed, right? That's a good thing. But the problem is that if you have too many, they sit there and they're not doing anything and you can't trigger them. If you don't have the right spells in hand to make this stuff happen, then these things just sit there for a few turns and you could just have used that mana on something else. Now, that's not to say these are bad to put in a deck, quite the opposite. Every deck needs between 1 and 4 enablers. 4 is pushing it honestly though, but if the deck runs well with them, then that's great. I've been in a situation before where I've had 3 enablers in my hand and no creatures out, and so they were just dead weight, and I couldn't do anything. If you're in a blue deck, counterspells are your enablers. Yeah, they can be considered removal as well, I suppose, but in certain decks, like a Tromokrakus deck, you're going to want those counterspells for the deck to run. I saw someone's Tromokrakus deck that was he just wanted to swing with that creature. So the counterspells were crucial in keeping it out. So he had a bunch of counterspells. You've got to find the balance in your deck though, so not too many, but having at least one of them is fine. Again, playtest over and over again to see how it feels, and mono blue decks are probably different than the rest. Okay, now here's where things get a little bit funky. I call the next 2 to 3 spots the flex spots. These take the form of a lot of different things. I usually like to think of them as the charm spots. Pick any charm that has some modes to it and bam, you've got a flex card. Abzan charm, for example, can count as targeted removal, card draw, or a sort of enabler, whereas Naya charm can be used as a small removal, retrieval, or a sort of win con. This also works with the command cards, because they kind of have the same mode type things too. Cryptic command, Gix's command, or Prismara command, for example. Now, you don't have to choose a charm or command for your flex spots. These spots are meant to flex to your deck's needs, just like these spells do. If you need more creatures in the deck, put in an extra creature. If you need more protection, flex in that protection. These spots are simply here to give you some wiggle room while deck building. Another good example of this is Vivian, Champion of the Wilds. Her passive and +1 abilities both sort of act as enablers for your deck, so she could slot in as that. But her -2 ability kind of acts as an impulse draw, so you can kind of use that as that. Look at these kind of cards that can act as multiple things. That way you could consider this an enabler and a card draw spell. She's not 100% perfect for either of those slots, but it really does flex to fill a couple of needs. That's basically it. Those are the cards I try to slot into all of my decks, just as a starting template, of course. But there are a couple of other things I should mention first. There are nuance slots for decks. These are not strictly part of the deck, but rather additions that should swap other spots in your deck. I'm talking about tutors and just extra things. You can slot in 1 to 5 of these in your deck, but if you put in more tutors, your deck will probably be more competitive, just as a general rule of thumb. And extra things are like Eternal Witness that brings something back from your graveyard to your hand. These are things that you don't necessarily need or even want in every deck, and that's why they're nuanced. Do I need E-Witness in my Neyith deck, for example, to run? No. Do I need a Vampiric Tutor in a demon deck to find the specific demon I want? No. Okay, you could argue against this, but it really just depends on the person and how they want to run their deck. I've heard of a lot of people saying that they don't run tutors intentionally because it makes the gameplay too repetitive and they don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And there are plenty of decks that don't run graveyard retrieval that run smoothly. Black decks are the exception, of course. Again, these are all about how you want to play, and if you'd like to put these cards in your deck, first, think of which bread and butter things that aren't absolutely necessary and remove them first. A tutor can easily replace that spot because the bread and butter stuff is almost always what you go for anyway. So if you swap one, then you're probably fine. If you have a hard time getting rid of all your precious cards that you put in so much time and effort in getting, and you don't want to swap them out, use the flex spots. That's what the flex spots are there for. Slot in those tutors into those. Okay, this was a pretty fun experience, and I'm so glad you stayed with me till the end. I've bookmarked every spot in the video so you can come back later to review it if you're ever in need of assistance while building your next deck. This is not a perfect way to build the perfect deck. This is just my way of building. If you don't like it, you can just ignore everything I said and find a different video that you like better. You know, it doesn't matter to me. In any case, thank you for watching. If you need any cards for your deck, click on the TCGplayer affiliate link in the description below, and make sure you join me next week for your weekly dose of magic.